Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We're going to be going through my initial analysis of Microsoft's Project Scorpio, which is meant to be a 4K iteration of their Xbox One. Now, I did say this is my initial analysis, which is going to be going through an overview of the system. In the future, I'll also be producing videos targeting specific components of the system, for example, the CPU, the GPU, the memory, compute, and also tackling subjects like high dynamic range 4K. But this is a very large subject, and of course things could change over the coming weeks as more information of both the Neo and the Scorpio emerge. So with that said, I guess the best thing is let's start. Microsoft formally announced the Xbox Scorpio during its E3 2016 press conference, even showing off a trailer for the console. The reveal was so surprising because of a couple of reasons. The system won't be ready until holiday 2017, almost 18 months into the future as of the time I'm recording this, and the second reason is the massive performance Microsoft are touting the Scorpio to offer. 6 teraflops of GPU performance and 320GB per second of memory bandwidth are impressive figures, dwarfing the leaks surrounding Sony's own upgraded PS4 hardware, the Neo. The number of leaks surrounding Project Scorpio, and with Sony confirming that they were working on their own console, but that it too wouldn't be shown at E3, Microsoft were giving a fine opportunity. They could deflate some of the anticipation surrounding the Neo, and also not be alone on stage by having nothing to show off other than vague promises of 4K gaming nirvana. To be fair to Microsoft, of course, they have at least shown a trailer. By the way, guys, there is some background noise here. It's ridiculously hot in the UK, despite the fact that it's pissing down with rain, so I can only apologise. I'm going to do my best to remove the background noise post-recording, but otherwise I'm going to be dead by the time I get halfway through this video. Anyway, well, largely the bets have paid off, and now eyes are set firmly on Microsoft's new commitment to both PC gaming and the promises of upgraded Xbox capable of cutting-edge graphics to power hungry users. With information regarding the components of the machine is a little ambiguous, to say the least, there is enough information out there given the technology available to Microsoft's leaks and interviews, and of course the Scorpio's trailer itself, to predict the types of hardware within inside the machine. I guess the first thing we need to talk about, this GPU upgrade. So Microsoft's 6 teraflops in the number 1 in console performance territory. They repeated it several times over as the fastest console available. 6 teraflops quite simply dwarfs the rumoured 4.2 teraflops Sony are cramming inside the PlayStation 4 Neo's GPU. Whether coincidence or intent, Scorpio possesses about 40% advantage over the Neo, which is roughly on par between the gulf between the vanilla systems and the original Xbox One. Something Sony took advantage of with their marketing of the system. If the current figures for both the Neo and Scorpion turn out to be the same as the final retail hardware, the Neo will be about 2.28 times the speed of the vanilla PS4, while the Scorpio will be about 4.58 times that of the vanilla Xbox One. Sticking with Neo for a moment, the rumour puts the Neo as featuring 36 compute units, for a total of 2,304 shaders, and these are clocked at a fairly conservative 911 MHz. For those following along with AMD's Polaris 10 lineup, the number of CUs will be pretty familiar. It's the same number found within the RX 480. The primary difference here is the chosen clock speed. As I said, Sony are being fairly conservative with its GPU clocks, though who knows, with pressure from Scorpio, maybe they will increase the clock speed, for example at 11 hour. Microsoft did very similar with the original Xbox One, because they found that the yields were acceptable. They increased the GPU clock and the ESRAM clocks from 800 MHz to 853. Since it's almost certain that Sony and Microsoft will be using the Polaris architecture, both companies can enjoy a host of benefits thanks to GCN 4.0. Improved memory compression, which is data is losslessly squeezed and shunted around the card, think WinZip. Hardware schedule to better saturate the GPU shaders and other components with work. Primitive discard accelerator to discard pieces of a scene being drawn early in the rendering process if it's obscure from view. Instruction prefetch, which helps preempt what data is going to be used next and have it on deck and ready to be worked on, which is very much like CPUs work, and improved shader efficiency, which is somewhat ambiguous, but we can just speculate it's going to basically do more work. While the Neo's clocks are a mere 911 MHz, which provides 4.2 T-flops of single precision performance, which Sony were aiming for, the desktop variant of the RX 480 clocks in at 1266 MHz, but even those ultra-high clocks fall short of Microsoft's claimed Project Scorpio's performance. If the heatsink and fan assembly shown in the Scorpio's trailer is accurate, it would mean that Microsoft would have to clock the GPU insanely high to hit 6 T-flops. Microsoft would need the GPU core to be at around 1305 MHz to reach 6 teraflops of performance. And while there are some reports that the RX 480s can reach insane overclocks of 14 to 1500 MHz, it's unlikely Microsoft would either find the yields acceptable at those speeds, or the frankly weedy heatsink fan assembly would just not be ample enough to extract the amount of heat produced. This leads us to a couple of conclusions. We're either looking at a completely custom GPU with a larger number of compute units based upon the RX 480, perhaps the RX 480X if you will, or Microsoft are just going to use a Vega variant. Examining the latter option for a moment, because we have more information about that at least, the leaks and rumours hint that Vega 10 will support 64 compute units, so theoretically, Microsoft should get a great deal on either bad yield Vega cores, which simply don't meet either the clock speeds or criteria in terms of compute units for the upcoming Fury replacements, or Microsoft are simply adopting lower end Vega GPUs for Project Scorpio. Since AMD are being less than forthcoming about Vega, believe me, I've tried to find out. Yeah. All we can do is speculate how many SKUs will fall within the Vega lineup. Microsoft have also benefited more about the robust compute setup compared to the current Xbox One, and should theoretically have a similar number of aces and compute queues to the current PS4. Compute is becoming increasingly important for games, and because, once again, rumours and speculation, neither the Neo or Scorpio will have a top-of-the-line CPU, we'll get to that, it's probable that shifting yet more work from the CPU to the GPU work will be key to keeping up high frame rates. The current Xbox One manages with just 2 ACEs, asynchronous compute engines, also known as AMD's specialized processor, which schedules compute work over the GPU, which contain 8 compute queues each. Sony's machine employs 8 ACEs with the same number of compute queues, meaning you have 16 versus 64 total, with Sony's machine sporting a better scheduling options. Considering 8 ACEs are now standard in many of AMD's GPUs, for example Tonga, it's probable that a similar number or greater will be found within the GCN 4.0 architecture. In theory, we might also see the removal or fewer move engines, as their primary function was to shunt data around inside the system. For example, moving data from DDR3 memory to the ESRAM or vice versa. Now, it's quite interesting because the absence of those move engines would free up a lot of space on the SoC. There were 4 hardware move engines in the original Xbox One, with the first 2 responsible for textures, the third also handling lossless decoding, and the final one also used for system usage. For example, JPEG decoding and also textures, which could be handy for video. Rumours are that it was utilised a lot for Kinect, for example, for Kinect Video, where it was capturing the video or your images and then obviously shunting it around the system. Microsoft may still keep a few of those move engines for Kinect usage, but it's probable they'd rather spend that space on more CUs or cache or other components and make up for the absence of move engines using the other components, in other words a greater number of compute units and a more robust CPU, that type of jazz. Speaking of CPU, Microsoft have formally announced a few specifications of Project Scorpio, but they weren't so keen to divulge information on the CPU, aside that it's 8 cores. Despite Sony formally announcing very little about the Neo, leaks have tagged the CPU as being very similar to the current PS4 model, but operating at around 2.1 GHz. which is around a 500 MHz hike from the original system. So there's a couple of options we're left with here, with Microsoft not giving more information. It's possible that they've not settled on the CPU, or that it's less impressive than the rest of the specifications. Let's face it, AMD are virtually certain to be producing the rest of the SoC, and we're left with the logical conclusion that Microsoft's choice of CPU is based on AMD's current or upcoming, near upcoming processor lineup. Realistically, these choices mean another Jaguar-based CPU, or perhaps Puma, running at a similar clock speed to Neo, or Zen. Let's examine Zen first, as it's probably the more interesting of the options. We would see a hefty improvement in several key areas. Firstly, Zen has a 40% improvement IPC from AMD's current desktop lineup, and also SMT, simultaneous multi-threading. If Microsoft were talking of 8 physical cores, we'd, in theory, once again that beautiful phrase, see Scorpio actually realistically being able to handle 16 threads. Or, once again, in theory, Microsoft could just use 4 real cores and SMT for 8 logical threads. There are a couple of holes in the Zen theory though. Microsoft are rather cagey about the CPU specs, and one would imagine they would be quick to market the usage of the upcoming Zen-based CPU. And this, they don't want to give away those details, are under NDA, that type of thing. Price would also be another concern. 16 threads would also result in a lot of optimization work from developers, and that probably wouldn't make sense. Imagine if you're trying to create a title that has, let's say, 14 threads available to it in the Scorpio, and then trying to narrow those down for the vanilla Xbox One. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. The other elephant in the room is size. Size matters when designing CPUs, SoCs, that type of thing. The SoC can only be so big. It can't be as big as the bloody console. And Zen cores will be larger, given the addition of the extra compute units for the GPU and all of the other components. Even if we take into account the absence of ES RAM, it's arguable Microsoft or AMD wouldn't be thrilled at adding this additional space to the die. So, while we can't discount Zen, I would say it's less likely than the other option. So it's possible, probable, Microsoft are following Sony's train of thought and logic and sticking with the current Jaguar CPUs, which would also be cheaper. A Jaguar CPU with a hefty upclock, there's nothing wrong with this approach, per se, providing the CPUs are sufficiently snappy enough to feed the GPU with enough data from keeping the CPU from being the slowest ship in Scorpio's convoy. Both companies could, however, opt to use Puma or Puma Plus cores, which are essentially refined Jaguars. They gobble up less power to run at the same clocks, and have another benefit: they can run at higher clock speeds. For reference, about 2.5 GHz for Puma. While the prospect of a business as usual approach may be less exciting, it doesn't mean that the system will necessarily be CPU starved. Particularly with a decent clock speed hike, assuming Microsoft can squeeze, let's say, 2.1 to 2.3 GHz out of chip, factoring graphical upgrades such as higher resolution and better lighting, it comes down to the GPU doing most of that work, and being CPU bound will likely more impact the frame rates than anything else. What about memory? So the original Xbox One was on the receiving end of a hell of a lot of flack, not just because of lack of graphical performance thanks to fewer compute units than the PS4, but also Microsoft being a lot more conservative regarding its decisions about memory. As a quick refresher, the PS4 used 8GB of GDDR5 memory clocked at 5500 MHz, which provides 176GB per second of bandwidth. While the Xbox One used the more traditional DDR3 memory, which obviously had considerably less memory bandwidth at around 68GB per second, and that was 8GB as well, whereas it also featured 32MB of ES RAM, which is about 218GB per second peak memory bandwidth, but often would achieve far less in real-world scenarios. To summarize, it led to bandwidth constrictions and additional fine-tuning for the system, and combined with lack of raw shader output for the system's GPU, it spelt the beginnings of the so-called resolution gate, which did the rounds for several months after the release of both systems. It's extremely unlikely, therefore, Microsoft would opt to use ESRAM, which would need to be drastically increased in amount, even slightly useful at the proposed 4K number, and it would eat up massive amounts of die space and add additional developmental complexity for no real benefit, given the inclusion of what we know is GDDR5 on the board. Similarly, we can rule out the inclusion of either High Bandwidth Memory 2 or High Bandwidth Memory 1, due to the stated maximum memory bandwidth touted by Microsoft, and also images of the GDDR5 chips. Quite simply, the 320 gigabytes per second, which is the figure Microsoft are flaunting, is just not fast enough to be High Bandwidth Memory 1 or 2. And also 6 T-flops of Project Scorpio is just not enough for that memory bandwidth. But the biggest hint is actually of the SoC and the surrounding GDDR5 memory itself. Microsoft were not forthcoming with either bus width, the clocks, or the amount of memory, but we can start making some guesses based upon the images that are shown. Now, if you do some basic math, in other words 1 plus 2 plus 3, and you start counting them, there are 12 chips which are visible, unless there are some hidden in some other location on the circuit, or some behind, or underneath rather, which is extremely unlikely. Therefore, we can assume that there are 12 chips, and this provides 320 gigabytes per second goal, because if you take GDDR5 memory clock just shy of 7 GHz and a 384-bit bus, this makes the most sense. Now, there are other configurations which are possible. For example, a 256-bit bus using GDDR5X memory, and 12 chips also hint the amount of RAM which is available on the console. 12 gigabytes. Why 12? Well, just because of the size of DRAM chips, 512 megabytes, 1 gigabyte, so on, it doesn't make sense for Microsoft to be aiming for 6 gigabytes, because that would be less than the current Xbox One, and good luck trying to run 4K on that. 24 gigabytes isn't exactly realistic either, and so this really eliminates all other options aside from 12. We can also make the guess that 384 is slightly more realistic because GDDR5X is slightly more expensive. But unfortunately, because we don't know the chips themselves, we're only making guesswork. So it's either 256-bit with GDDR5X or 384 with, once again, 7 GHz clock. From what we know about both the PS4 Neo and the Xbox Scorpio, it would appear that the Scorpio has the memory advantage in terms of bandwidth and amount, because the vanilla PS4 had 8 gigabytes of memory, and the Neo is very similar. Sony have allocated an additional 512 megabytes of RAM to developers, but this is from OS reserves. In short, they've not sold an additional memory to the system. If you remember back in the days of the leaks of the Xbox One SDK and also images released by various developers, including Sucker Punch and so on, you might recall both the PS4 and the Xbox One offer 5 gigabytes of RAM available to developers. With Sony, 4.5 gigabytes is managed by developers, with the additional 512 megabytes as flexible memory, which the game does reside in, and it is the game's memory, but developers do not control it. The PS4's OS controls it itself. Assuming the leaks are accurate, this 5 gigabyte figure for the Neo will be bumped up to 5.5 gigabytes, and as one can imagine, running high resolution textures, better lighting, better geometry and all of that stuff, we might start hitting into a memory wall. And there are posts on the internet, and how much credence you want to give to them, it's up to you, but some developers are already a bit concerned about this. Microsoft's approach is simpler. They've just added in more memory. Now, we're going to assume the same reserves are in place for Project Scorpio, which is about 3 gigabytes. Once again, if you take 8, you take away 3, that leaves you with 5, so we can therefore assume that the same thing roughly is going to be with Project Scorpio. This gives you 9 gigabytes available to developers, which should allow developers to really explore higher resolution gaming. The only issue with this is larger shadows, bigger maps, better geometry, and all of the other effects that we've just talked about. For example, even the inclusion of Trace FX, which is obviously AMD's hair physics awesomeness that we've covered a couple of times on the channel before, is that you actually need to get them into memory. We can presume, therefore, that Microsoft might opt for either a faster hard drive than the 5400 RPM drive that's present inside the current Xbox One models, perhaps a hybrid drive if Microsoft feels the cost is worth it, or, better yet, they'll just take a leaf out of Sony's approach and they'll just allow users to upgrade how and as they wish, which I think would be the much better option. I think Sony nailed that. The other benefit give developers a more unified memory system, mostly in terms of how they think of bandwidth and how they think of writing to and from memory. In the original Xbox One, ESRAM was used to either store frame buffer, or in some cases other portions of the final image were palmed off to slower DDR3 memory, but the ESRAM could be used for anything you really wanted, including compute work or storing certain pieces of data, but the Xbox One's GPU had exclusive access to it. While Microsoft's various PICs, which is Performance Investigator for Xbox updates, allow developers to better optimize ESRAM usage, it still makes things a lot simpler with just one memory pool. To quote our SDK analysis on this very subject, the Xbox One is capable of running split rendered targets. What does this mean? Well, simply, sky textures, regions of the screen with a lot of overdraw, ground textures and so on are best rendered with slower DDR3 memory. You can also have, say, the Z buffer, also known as the depth buffer, in ESRAM, while keeping color targets in, say, DRAM. 70% of the image, roughly, could be held in ESRAM, with the ESRAM hitting about 11 megabytes versus the DRAM at just under 5 megabytes, for example. We can also presume that onion and garlic buses will make a return. They were present in both the Xbox and the PS4, with a bus heading from the CPU to RAM, a GPU bus to the memory, and in the PS4 there was a more robust compute system, which added a third bus known as Super Onion, which connected the CPU and GPU and other components together. In short, it's probable Microsoft will take a few tricks out of Sony's books when it comes to the simplicity and elegance of the system's design. The original Xbox One's OS took its pound from flesh in various reserves available for the game, much like the PlayStation 4. From what we're reading about the Neo, it would appear Sony are going not to change the OS reserves and actually give up more available RAM to the machine. Both the PS4 and the Xbox One have 6 full CPU cores for the game software. However, if developers wish, Core 0 typically handles the setup for the other 5 CPUs. But at some point, Microsoft and Sony both opted to allow the 7th CPU cores to be usable and accessible to developers, at least partially. In the case of the Xbox One, at least 50% of the 7th core is always available, assuming they're not using Kinect and that type of stuff. But assuming Kinect and other OS tasks are available, this amount can decrease. It's important to note because it makes one wonder if the faster CPUs in terms of the raw clock speed, once again assuming that we are using Jaguar or Puma, will be capable of handling enough workload to just have one core dedicated to OS functionality, thus freeing up the entire 7th core rather than just having, say, 50% of it available. This would allow, in theory, developers to better optimize their software knowing that a larger amount of CPU time available on the 7th core, and possibly on Neo as well. Because, let's face it, if you know you've got 100% of that CPU always available, you can work accordingly, you can optimize your title to always know that you've got that available, and once again, if you're running on either Scorpio or Neo, it can take advantage of that level of performance. Of course, it's always possible that faster clock speed isn't enough to just have one CPU core handling all of this extra workload for the OS. One can also wonder if Microsoft will have additional stuff Scorpio's OS in the background, which could lead to very similar reserve situation or increase in memory footprint for the Scorpio. This is particularly true if we do start seeing virtual reality headsets supported and they require large driver overheads or whatever other software to operate on top of the game and operating system. So, virtual reality and 4K ready. I do want to put out another video on this, really examining this very subject, but for now I want to give my initial thoughts. The primary selling point of the Scorpio is Microsoft's promise to push 4K into our living rooms. But as of right now, the number of homes with 4K displays is pretty tiny compared to the number of 1080p televisions. Obviously, there are figures which will change over the coming months and years, including the rise of HDR, but let's face it, developers will likely need to make their decisions based upon the here and now rather than future promises. It's probable that many developers will opt to not push the 4K native resolution and instead focus their time and energy on a much larger market of 1080p televisions by improving the visual quality. Or perhaps using intermediate resolutions natively, for example 1440p, to either downsample to 1080p or to improve the quality of an upscaled 4K image compared to, let's say, running at 1080p. Phil Spencer has even clarified to developers that they are free to use the hardware however they'd like.
In other ways, yeah. We'll absolutely be open to that. I mean, we're going to talk more specifics about Project Scorpio, so we'll get into more of the details. But I think creative freedom and how you want to use the power of the box is something that I always support. I mean, I came from first party, as you guys know, so putting the right tools in the hands of the creators, the best creators, is our job as the platform.
While the PlayStation 4 Neo and the Xbox Scorpio are being created for allegedly 4K gaming, there's a question, would they even be capable of running 4K games? Well, the answer is, it depends, and we're certainly going to be doing more analysis of this in a future video. But higher resolutions put greater workload on the GPU, and as we've discussed earlier, 4K is 4 times the number of pixels of 1080p, therefore it almost cancels out the performance upgrades from the original Xbox to the Scorpio. Therefore it's very unlikely we're going to see 4K at 60 frames per second with true AAA titles. Simply put, you're going to once again run out of GPU performance, and it's a very similar problem that even top-of-the-line GPUs on the PC, for example the Fury X, or even the recently released GTX 1080 are capable of providing. Given what we've discussed regarding the fact that yes, 4K TVs are becoming more popular, but there's certainly nowhere near the market saturation of 1080p TV sets yet, we're probably going to see a lot of developers go with intermediary resolutions of, let's say, 1080p or 1440p, but with either higher frame rates and better visual quality. But unfortunately, only time will tell. Microsoft, AMD and other folks in the graphics industry are also pushing towards high dynamic range. This means that we're going to see a greater amount of colours on screen, better separation between lights and darks and the colours in between, and overall more vivid and more detailed image quality. Robert Halleck from AMD in one of our exclusive interviews said that there isn't really that much more performance demands on a GPU, because typically a game engine will automatically render in HDR and then tone mapping will map the colours accordingly. But with 4K televisions rising up and slowly the market moving towards high dynamic range televisions, admittedly at an even slower rate than 4K, things are a little up in the air at the moment. There are also other questions. For example, how much more can Microsoft squeeze out of DirectX 12? We know that when the Xbox One was first released, it used a DirectX 11.x variant. Since then, numerous operating system improvements have emerged onto the system, for example, 7th CPU core, and of course, we're even starting to see the first DirectX 12 Xbox One titles emerge on the system. Developers have already confirmed this. Regarding virtual reality, Project Scorpio's 6 teraflops of GPU performance is certainly higher than the minimum mandate which Oculus and other headset display manufacturers are putting out, which is an R9 290 or a GTX 970, which are the minimum specifications. And one can likely assume this will bode well for a great virtual reality system on the machine if that's what Microsoft, headset manufacturers, game developers, and finally the market itself, which really means you and I, the people buying the damn software, want. For now, Microsoft have left us with an interesting pickle, but more so Sony. Sony cannot simply make up the gulf between the Xbox One Scorpio and the PS4 Neo by just upclocking the GPU. They can certainly raise the speed gap, but they'd need to hit over 1300 megahertz to stand a chance against Scorpio, and they'd still be behind in both memory bandwidth and memory quantity. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't do it. The system's not released yet, but if they carry on with business as usual and they don't do a radical redesign, they're certainly going to be behind in terms of performance. We'll certainly do more analysis on Scorpio and Neo and what HDR and 4K games mean in your future, but for now we're left a hell of a lot of questions. We're left with questions such as, what are about the big concerns of Xbox and PS4 owners? How will their launch systems fare when the new systems appear on store shelves? Both Microsoft and Sony assure us there will not be exclusive games on Project Scorpio or the PS4K/Neo, but listening to developers gush about hardware performance on Project Scorpio reveals video leaves us with wonder.
We get to much greater and better game experiences as a result.
We're moving Fallout 4 to VR, and to have a console that can support that at the resolution and speed that we really want, I think it's going to be magical.
It leaves us to wonder, can developers truly optimize an experience when the hardware disparity is so great between the upcoming redesigns and the current systems that you may have in your living room? Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. It was a hell of a lot longer than what I had anticipated it to be, if I'm totally honest, and that's why I scripted most of this stuff. Let me know your thoughts on it. Yeah. Hopefully you've enjoyed it enough to subscribe or like or share or whatever, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.